Welcome back. It's number 7 from Bedtime Bible Stories for Children, Homer Francis Rogers. Number 7 is called A Double Wedding, a Midnight Wrestler. Find it in the book of Genesis 29 to 35. Isaac's wife Rebekah had a brother named Laban. As luck would have it, when Jacob came to the country of his mother's people, he fell in with a bunch of ranch hands that worked for Laban. With them was the prettiest girl he'd ever seen. She was Rachel, Laban's youngest daughter, and it was love at first sight. So Jacob went home with Rachel and met his kinfolk and told his uncle Laban all that had happened and why he had to come to visit him. Jacob went to work for his uncle and became like a member of the family. Laban had 2 daughters. The older girl, Leah, was rather plain, with soft, large, tender eyes and a sweet face and disposition, sort of quiet and modest. The younger girl, Rachel, was a vivid, beautiful girl with flashing eyes and an impish smile, vivacious and full of fun and frolic. Jacob was completely captivated by Rachel, and he agreed to work for Laban for 7 years if he'd let him marry Rachel. Laban, who knew a good thing when he saw it, agreed. So Jacob went to work on Laban's ranch for 7 years. And it seemed like the 7 years were no more than 7 days because of his love for Rachel. At the end of 7 years, Jacob went to Laban and said, "Let's arrange for the wedding. The 7 years are all over." They planned a big wedding. Friends and relatives came from miles around, and there was feasting and dancing. Well, sir, that Laban was a foxy one. They had a custom in that country that the younger daughters couldn't get married until the older ones were all married off, so Laban took his older daughter Leah and dressed her up in a wedding dress and covered her face with a veil, and they had the ceremony. When it was all over and lifted her veil, Jacob saw he had married the wrong girl, and boy, was he furious. Poor Leah must have felt really bad, because Jacob turned away from her and went raging up to his father-in-law and said, "What is the meaning of this? For 7 years I worked for you for free so that I could marry Rachel. And you have switched girls on me," and he said a lot of other things I think I'd better not repeat. Boy, was he mad. Laban explained to him about their custom of marrying off the older girls first, and didn't even apologize for deceiving him, and was sort of smug and superior about it all. But there Jacob was, already married to Leah, so he agreed with Laban to work for him another 7 years. For the youngest daughter, he was pretty put out. But Jacob loved Rachel, so he would have agreed to work 70 years if he had to. So about a week later, they had another big wedding, and now Jacob found himself with 2 wives. He loved Rachel so much more than Leah, although he had to admit that Leah was a really nice, sweet girl, that even though the girls were sisters, it was easy to see there was going to be jealousy and friction in the family. And there was. The 2 girls didn't get along well with each other at all, and the situation wasn't helped any when it turned out that Leah began to have children right and left, a fine family of good-looking boys. But Rachel did not have any children at all. Rachel fussed at Jacob about it like it was somehow all his fault, and Jacob got mad at Rachel. They had a first-class family quarrel. The 7 years passed, and several more, and Jacob kept on working for Laban, and he was now in charge of the whole ranch like a manager or a foreman. Finally, at long last, Rachel had a son, and named him Joseph. We'll be hearing quite a bit more about this Joseph, for it turns out that he was to be a very important person. Rachel was beside herself with joy, and Jacob was pretty pleased too. Jacob had now been working for his father-in-law for nearly 20 years, and he decided it was about time for him to go back home to his own people. So he went to Laban and told him he wanted to pack up and go. Now Jacob had been such a good manager of Laban's ranch that he had gotten richer and richer, and Laban didn't want to lose him. They argued and bickered, and Jacob felt he was entitled to some back wages. But Laban didn't want him to go at all, and certainly didn't want him to give him any extra wages. They finally agreed that Jacob was to work 1 more year, and after that, they would divide the flocks and herds. Jacob was to have for his own all of the spotted sheep and cattle, and Laban would keep the white ones. Well, so for all that year, it seemed that every lamb or calf that was born on the place was spotted or speckled. And at the end of the year, Jacob had a huge flock of sheep and cattle. He gathered up everything that he owned and lit out for home without even saying goodbye. Before they left, Rachel had gone into her daddy's private chapel and helped herself to a lot of the statues and religious articles. So when Laban discovered that Jacob and his family had gone, and that he was missing some of the things from his chapel, he chased after Jacob and caught up with him about a 3 days' journey away. Laban accused Jacob of stealing and fussed at him for running off without giving him a chance to say goodbye to his daughters and his grandchildren. Jacob got real sore and denied stealing anything and offered to let Laban search through all their baggage. Rachel hadn't told Jacob about swiping the statue, so she sat down in a big chair and cleverly hid the statues under her skirt. Laban searched through all the luggage, and naturally he didn't find what he was looking for. This left him puzzled, for he was certain somebody had made off with his things. But he apologized, and they had a big supper and said goodbye again and again. As they got closer and closer to where Esau lived, Jacob got more and more worried because he remembered Esau's threat to kill him for taking his birthright and his blessing. So he sent messengers ahead to find out how things were, and they came back and told him that Esau was coming that way with 400 soldiers. Jacob knew then that he was a goner, but he kept his head and divided his family and his flocks into 2 bands and separated them by quite some distance. He told them that if Esau attacked one band, the other was to run like crazy away from there. Then Jacob gathered up a huge herd of sheep and goats and camels and cows and donkeys and divided them up into a number of different groups and sent them on ahead of him, separated from one another by a mile or 2. Old Esau and his 400 soldiers were coming on to meet Jacob. He'd got wind of the fact that Jacob was coming home somehow, and on the way he came across a herd of cattle being driven by some cowboys, and he said to one of the cowboys, "What's this?" The cowboy said, "These cattle are a present that your brother Jacob is sending to you." A little while later, Esau met another bunch of cattle, and still another and another, and the cowboys in charge of each one of them said, "These are a present Jacob is sending you." Jacob figured that by sending Esau a lot of gifts, a lot of different times, he'd soften him up so he wouldn't be as mad at him when they finally met. Jacob pitched camp that night by a river, and after supper he went off by himself to say some prayers and think things out. Maybe he fell asleep, maybe not. He knew it seemed real enough. Anyway, a stranger came along and challenged Jacob to a wrestling match. Now, Jacob fancied himself pretty good at wrestling, but this stranger was good too. And they wrestled all night long until about daybreak. And the stranger said, "Let me go, turn me loose. It'll soon be daylight." Jacob tightened his grip on the fellow and said, "I'm not going to turn you loose until you promise to give me a blessing." By that time, Jacob had begun to suspect that this stranger was no ordinary man, but some sort of an angel from God. The stranger promised to bless him. Jacob turned him loose, and the stranger gave him a blessing and said, "From now on, your name is not going to be Jacob, but Israel." That's how Jacob got his other name. And from then on, everybody called him Israel. And all his descendants are called the children of Israel, or the Israelites. Jacob was pretty tired out from wrestling all night, and he knew for sure that he hadn't been wrestling with any ordinary human being. When the sun came up good and hot, and Jacob figured he'd better be getting back before his wives and children got to worrying about where he was, he discovered that sometime during all that wrestling, he had thrown a hip out of joint, and he walked with a limp for the rest of his life. The next day they met Esau, and Esau acted glad to see Jacob and told him he wasn't mad at him anymore and that he needn't have given him all those cattle. Jacob didn't quite trust him, though, so he insisted that he keep the presents he had given him, and Esau agreed. Then Jacob pushed on with his family and his cowboys and the rest of the herds of cattle and came to a place called Succoth. There he built himself a fine home with lots of barns and feedlots for his cattle, and he settled down and became a prosperous rancher. He looked up old Isaac, his father, who was still alive, although he was terribly old by now, and Isaac died shortly thereafter. And Jacob had 12 sons, and the youngest of all them was Joseph, Rachel's boy. And Joseph was quite a remarkable lad, and we'll be hearing more about him. That'll be another story.